The United States has been trying to economically destroy Iran for over 4 decades. It has imposed sanctions, frozen assets, and explicitly stated its most recent goal as driving Iranian oil exports to zero. None of it worked the way Washington intended, and Iran's revolutionary government that American policymakers have been trying to weaken since 1979 has in many ways been made stronger by the very tools designed to break it. Now you might argue that the US is the most powerful country in the world and should be able to achieve its goals against Iran. However, it's not that simple, and in this video, I'm gonna explain why. The first thing you need to understand is the timeline. American sanctions on Iran did not begin with Donald Trump or Barack Obama or even the nuclear deal. You see, in November 1979, Iranian students stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 days. Subsequently, President Jimmy Carter froze roughly $12 billion in Iranian assets. That marked the opening move in what became the longest-running unilateral sanctions campaign any country has ever imposed on another in modern history. By the time Trump's first administration took office in 2017, Iran had already been living under American sanctions for nearly 40 years, and it had already learned something the United States kept underestimating: how to survive. Starting under President George Bush in 2005 and expanding under President Barack Obama, the US spent nearly a decade tightening economic pressure. More sanctions were added, Iranian banks were cut off from the global financial system, and the country's central bank became largely isolated. Europe joined the effort, while the United Nations passed multiple resolutions. The impact was severe. Iran's oil exports fell by more than half, inflation soared above 40%, and its currency lost around 60% of its value. Under mounting economic pressure, Iran agreed to negotiate. And in 2015, it signed the nuclear agreement, known as the JCPOA, accepting limits on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. But that apparent success masked a deeper reality. Iran didn't agree to the 2015 nuclear deal because sanctions had broken the regime. It agreed because the country's reformist leadership believed the agreement served its political and economic interests. Meanwhile, Iran's powerful hardline institutions, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Supreme Leader's office, and the conservative clerical establishment, never fully embraced the deal. Even as negotiations moved forward, they continued strengthening the military capabilities that sanctions were meant to restrain. So when the agreement eventually collapsed, Iran didn't start from scratch. It resumed its nuclear activities with years of additional knowledge and far less trust in negotiating with Washington. That brings us to 2018. After withdrawing the United States from the JCPOA, President Donald Trump launched what his administration called the Maximum Pressure Campaign. The strategy was simple: restore every major sanction, impose new ones, slash Iran's oil revenue, and drive the economy into such severe distress that Tehran would have little choice but to return to the negotiating table. The goal wasn't just a new nuclear deal. The administration also wanted Iran to curb its missile program, reduce support for regional proxy groups, and fundamentally change its behavior. Some officials even believed the economic pressure could destabilize the government itself. Economically, the campaign had a dramatic impact. Iran's official foreign exchange reserves plunged from around $70 billion in 2017 to an estimated $4 billion by 2020, a collapse that many analysts cited as evidence the sanctions were taking hold. In 2019, then-President Hassan Rouhani acknowledged that U.S. sanctions had cost Iran roughly $200 billion in lost oil revenue and investment. Despite the economic pressure, Iran did not renegotiate. Instead, Tehran escalated its nuclear program as leverage and began systematically building the infrastructure it would need to survive an indefinite future without access to Western financial systems. The most visible part of this response. Under the JCPOA, Iran had been required to keep uranium enrichment at or below 3.67%, far below weapons-grade levels, and to accept enhanced IAEA inspections. Once it became clear that maximum pressure meant receiving none of the economic benefits it had expected while still being treated as a sanctions target, Iran began systematically walking back its JCPOA commitments. It raised enrichment to 4.5% in 2019, then to 20% in early 2021 following the assassination of nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And by the time nuclear talks resumed in subsequent years, the time it would take Iran to build one nuclear weapon had fallen from roughly 1 year to a few weeks. But Iran's nuclear expansion was only part of its response. The bigger and less obvious strategy was changing how its economy worked. Instead of relying on trade with the West, Iran focused on becoming more self-reliant. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei formally called this the resistance economy. The idea was simple: produce more at home, rely less on foreign countries, and put more of the economy under institutions that could keep operating even under heavy sanctions. The biggest winner from this new economic strategy was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, better known as the IRGC, originally created after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution to protect the country's political system. The IRGC eventually grew far beyond a military force. Over the decades, it became one of the most powerful organizations in Iran, with influence over politics, security, and large parts of the economy. That economic influence didn't appear overnight. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the IRGC built its own engineering, construction, and logistics capabilities to support the war effort. When the fighting ended, those same capabilities were redirected toward rebuilding the country and expanding into major industries. Over time, the IRGC gained influence across construction, energy, telecommunications, ports, and shipping. By the time U.S. sanctions intensified, many analysts estimated that companies linked to the IRGC controlled somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of Iran's economy. The exact figure remains unclear because many of its businesses operate through holding companies and front companies that obscure who really owns them. But here's the irony in all of this. The very sanctions meant to weaken Iran ended up making the IRGC even stronger. As foreign companies pulled out of Iran and many private Iranian businesses struggled under the sanctions, the IRGC stepped in to fill the gap. Because it had already spent years operating under restrictions, it had its own networks for moving goods, handling money, and doing business outside the normal international system. In other words, the harsher the sanctions became, the more the IRGC's advantages grew. Instead of weakening one of Iran's most powerful institutions, the sanctions helped it expand its influence over the country's economy. The oil trade is where this dynamic is clearest. After Trump reimposed oil sanctions in 2018 and explicitly sought to drive Iranian oil exports to zero, Iran's formal export capacity collapsed, but a parallel system emerged almost immediately. Iran relied on what became known as the shadow fleet, hundreds of aging oil tankers that disguised where Iranian oil came from. Ships would turn off their tracking signals, transfer oil to other tankers at sea, change paperwork, and use shell companies to hide the cargo's true origin. By the time the oil reached a buyer, it often appeared to have come from another country altogether. None of this would have worked without Iran's key customer, China, as large Chinese state-owned companies backed away to avoid U.S. sanctions. Smaller independent refineries stepped in instead. Known as teapot refineries, these companies were willing to buy discounted Iranian oil despite the risks. Over time, they became the backbone of Iran's oil trade. By 2024, China was buying roughly 90% of Iran's exported oil, with most of it processed by these independent refineries. Iran had to sell its crude at prices well below the global market. But even at a discount, the sales generated billions of dollars that helped keep the country's economy running, despite years of sanctions. Throughout 2025, Iran was exporting an estimated 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels of oil per day to Chinese buyers, with shipping analysts describing the network as operating at full capacity, despite repeated rounds of new U.S. sanctions. The money flowing through this system didn't just support Iran's economy, it also strengthened the IRGC. And because the organization controlled much of the logistics behind the shadow oil trade, it captured a significant share of the revenue generated by those exports. Iran also found new ways to move and receive money. Instead of relying on the traditional banking system, it increasingly used overseas intermediaries, shell companies, barter deals, and in some cases, cryptocurrency. Chinese companies even exchanged goods and infrastructure projects for Iranian oil, allowing both sides to do business while avoiding many of the financial channels monitored by the United States. It wasn't until direct military action changed the equation that those exports were seriously disrupted. After the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran in early 2026, Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz, triggering a wider military confrontation and eventually a U.S. naval blockade, and for the first time in years, Iranian oil exports largely ground to a halt. The difference was clear: sanctions alone had not stopped the oil trade, direct military enforcement had. Because as long as China remained willing to buy Iranian oil and ships could leave Iranian ports, the shadow network had continued to function. But Iran's survival strategy extended far beyond oil. Over several decades under sanctions, Tehran had built what it called the Axis of Resistance, a network of allied armed groups across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, and previously Syria. These groups gave Iran influence far beyond its own borders and created a powerful deterrent against military action. The United States sanctioned many of these organizations, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and several Iraqi militias, but sanctions did little to stop them. Unlike banks or large companies, these groups operated inside their own territories, relied on local support, and used smuggling networks and informal financing that were far harder to disrupt. For Iran, this network became one of its most valuable strategic investments. It allowed Tehran to project power across the region and raise the potential cost of any attack against Iran itself, something economic sanctions alone could not take away. Perhaps the biggest lesson is not that sanctions never work, but that their success depends on who bears the cost. In Iran's case, those who suffered the most often had the least influence over the decisions the sanctions were meant to change.